Okay, this is Unit 6, Cognition and Memory. This is video 2. This is going to cover encoding. Most of the information can be found on page 258 to 265 in your textbook. Okay, so let's reflect on that three-box model of memory we were talking about before. Alright, so you have sensory, short-term to long-term. Encoding really takes place from the sensory to the short-term. Okay, and it also takes place again probably from the short term to the long term, but it's the process of typing in the information into your brain, okay, getting the information into your brain for storage. Okay, so how encoding works. We have a brain that allows parallel processing, so the processing of many aspects of a problem are completed at once. We're memorizing and doing stuff in our brain sometimes that we're not even aware of. Lots of multitasking occurs without knowledge of it, okay? And there's two different types of encoding that is taking place. You have your automatic coding, and then you have your effortful encoding in terms of memory. The first one is automatic processing. Automatic processing is the unconscious encoding of incidental information. So an example of this would be what table you were seated at a restaurant. If you were to walk into a restaurant and kind of reflect back to the last time maybe you were there, you could probably pick out exactly where you sat. It didn't take a lot of effort to memorize this. This is stuff that automatically happens. Maybe something that you ate for breakfast. You didn't have to sit there and say, I ate a granola bar, I ate a granola bar, I ate a granola bar. Okay, it just happens. Where on the page your a word was, so sometimes you can, when you're studying, sometimes you know exactly where you wrote that in your notebook. These are just the little incidental things that we remember. And then who you saw on the way to class today could be something that you didn't have to sit there and memorize. It just automatically happens. The different things with automatic processing that we process without thinking about is the space, time, frequency, and well-learned information. So kind of to break those down, the first one that we'll look at is space. A lot of the times we automatically process the space in terms of understanding it. So while studying, you often remember the page or the location of the answer in your notebook. You can visualize and understand exactly where it took place. Another one is frequency. You're able to remember how many times maybe you went to the bathroom today without even thinking about it. You could say, oh yeah, I went 6 times, or I went this many times. You're also able to remember the time in terms of the sequence of events of the day. So if I said, tell me 5 things you did today, you could say that you did this, 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 and usually you put them in order without too much thinking. Okay, and then you also often know, automatically process well-known meanings of things. So when you see something, you automatically are able to already know the meaning or the understanding behind it. For example, you may see my name, and then automatically you're thinking back to that experience because it's very well learned. The other one that you guys maybe have trouble with is the effortful processing. So Herman Ebbinghaus did a lot of memory exploration, and he was the one that tried to figure out how many terms we remember, or how often do we need to rehearse things in order for it to go into our memory. And one thing he explored was effortful processing. It is encoding that requires attention and conscious effort. So examples of this would be your vocabulary words, your dates, maybe names. But I have to remember 140 names in the beginning of the year. It takes a lot of effort in order for me to get to know everybody's names. The way I do it is rehearsal. Conscious repetition is the most common effortful processing technique. Over and over and over again. The more you say it, the better it'll be. It depends on the amount of time spent processing the information. Okay, and it also, they say overlearning or reviewing things you already know enhances retention. Okay, so a lot of the times the second time you go back to learn something, it's a lot quicker to do because you're just reviewing or you're overlearning the process of it. Another thing that we'll take a look at is spacing effect with memory. Okay, it's a phenomenon. It's the first phenomenon for the benefits of rehearsal. Okay, so why should we rehearse information when we're talking about encoding? Okay, according to Ebbinghaus, those who learn quickly forget quickly. All right, so if you're cramming all that information into your house, or into your brain. Okay, a lot of the times when you go back to reflect on it, you'll be able to spit it back the next day. But when we're talking about a month later, those of you that crammed will probably not be able to remember those items. We retain better when the rehearsal is distributed over time. Okay, so I have been reviewing with you for the final all semester. I've been testing you on the approaches. I've been testing you on parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Okay, I'm distributing this over time because studies say you'll do better if you constantly are reviewing it. We increase long-term retention when we study and practice over time. Cramming, they say, is inefficient means of studying. 300 experiments over the last century consistently reveal the benefits of spacing learning times. So Ebbinghaus has studied this over and over again. He studied students who crammed the night before versus students who studied all semester. And the students who study all semester usually end up with a higher score. Another thing is the serial positioning effect. This is the phenomenon for 2 with rehearsal. If I read you a list of terms right now, let's say 15 terms, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in class, you usually tend to remember the first items and the last items of the list. Okay, so we tend to remember the beginning, which is the primacy effect. Okay, more often you're rehearsing those items over and over again versus at the end of the list because it's the most recent. Okay, so think about a class maybe you had. One of my classes, maybe you remember what we did in the very beginning. Okay, it was fresh, it was good. And then you remember the last couple things before you guys left for the day. Right? Usually the stuff in the middle a lot of the times is forgotten. We also have levels of processing information. We have visual encoding, we have acoustic encoding, and you have semantic encoding. Visual encoding is that encoding with pictures. Okay, so sometimes we encode things by visually looking at it. We also have acoustic encoding, encoding with sounds or words. And then the last one is semantic encoding, the encoding of now you're understanding meaning behind it. So not only are you hearing something, not only are you seeing something, you're understanding the meaning behind the context. Okay, types of encoding, usually the semantic ones, the ones that have meaning or an explanation, percentage of who later recognized the word, 80% of, or 80, I would say 80 people tended to remember that item. Versus acoustic, people usually remember things that are heard or reviewed with them. So I am reteaching this to you. It may be more embedded in your memory. Versus the visual, if maybe you just saw something that has a very low retention for remembering it. So actually making meaning of the information and hearing it, you may have a better idea of understanding it. So levels of processing a word deeply by its meaning. Semantic produces better recognition of it later in time than to shallow processing by just looking at the word. Okay, so I've given you an example of these. I've described them to you. Okay, you're not just looking at it maybe on the page. Visual, they talked a little bit about different ways that we can visually remember things. Why is it we struggle to remember formulas, definitions, and dates, yet we can easily remember where we were yesterday or who we sat with and what we wore? That's because this is all mental picture. A lot of times we remember things better when they are in pictures. Different ways that we could do this with our information, or that we do this is using imagery, the rosy retrospection idea. Okay, mnemonic devices, and then the peg word system are all different visuals in order to help us remember. First one, imagery. Remember words that involve visuals more than low imagery words. So a lot of the times if the word is something that's a visual, we more tend to remember that word because we can picture it versus just an idea that doesn't have much meaning behind it or a visual behind it. So for example, if I gave you this list, pig, cancel, snowing, tornado, or interpret, and then I asked you in 10 minutes what were those words, you probably could remember pig because you can picture a pig. You might remember snowing because you could picture the snow coming, and then a tornado, you could picture a tornado. But people often less likely remember interpret or cancel because you can't see those things. So you tend to remember more terms if they connect with a picture, is what imagery is. Another visual that we could use is the loci. It's a device used to help retain images by traveling on a journey through a house in order to remember a list. And we're going to do this one in class. But the idea is if you have 10 items to remember, what they say to do is they say to place those 10 items throughout your house, kind of go on a journey throughout your house and put the items in different areas. And since you're visually putting them in different areas, you might tend to remember. So if I had a grocery list and one of my items was cheese, okay, that I needed to remember, I would say something like, I walked through the front door and stepped on the cheese. Okay, I then went to the toaster and placed the tea bags in there. Okay, so then when I'm actually going to the grocery store, I can kind of replay the journey in my house, like, oh, I stepped on the cheese, and then the toaster, it was the tea bag. So if you can visualize this stuff, it maybe helps you a little bit more in remembering. Another idea with visuals is usually the idea of rosy retrospection. Usually when we're telling a story, they're only telling the story of the high points, even though there may be a horrible situation that occurred. Okay, so you're talking about, I talk about college, and I talk about how fun it was. It was great. I'm only giving you the positive side of the story, walking away from something that's very, like, exciting. Yay! But in actuality, if I sat back and reflected on it, okay, college wasn't super exciting and all it's cracked up to be. There was a ton of work behind it, papers and exams, okay, and it was expensive. But a lot of times when you're sharing a story, you only share the really good details, the positive aspect of it. A happy fact of life for most people, the negative emotions recalled from bad events fade more rapidly than the positive ones. So let's talk about the good old days. Oh, the days way back when were so good. No technology. Everybody was communicating through face-to-face communication. But I'm sure there was also some negatives to the good old days. Mnemonic device is another visual. Okay, it's a memory aid, especially those techniques that use vivid imagery and organizational devices. Okay, they help with memory tricks. They often use imagery. We've talked about some this year. Some Pigs Can Fly. Okay, where they turn words into visuals in order for you to remember certain ideas or terms. Okay, Holmes is another one that helps you remember the Great Lakes. So I know that you've used a lot of mnemonic devices, and they're a great tool in order for remembering things. Okay, another visual is the peg word system. Okay, this is another one where it uses imagery in order for you to remember a list of terms. Okay, so here is a jingle that they came up with: 1 bun, 2 shoe, 3 tree, and it goes all the way up to 10. All right, so they would say 1 bun phone. Okay, so you're putting the bun and the phone together. 2 shoe apples. 3 tree frogs. So when you're going through and trying to remember this list again, you might go 1 bun phone. 2 shoe apple. 3 tree frogs. And then it helps you remember the different terms. Again, we will practice this one in class, but that's the peg word system. Another visual that you could use in order to remember terms or ideas is the self-reference effect. The idea that we remember things when they can relate to ourselves. So a lot of the times I have you guys give examples of your own life, or how does this apply to you. Okay, we can use this a lot in psychology class because there's a lot of terms that we can kind of, how does this relate to you, or how does this connect you, or how have you used your brain today, all right, in order to remember all the different parts. Other organizational tools that help us encode, okay, chunking, acronyms, and hierarchies, right, are other tools. First one is chunking. It's an organizational strategy where we put information into together in manageable units. Okay, so instead of just taking psychology all year and just opening up the textbook and starting with the first page and going all the way to the end of the textbook, we obviously have chunked it down into 12 manageable units. Okay, each then unit is chunked down into different subunits. They say when we chunk information together and make it more manageable, it's easier for us to understand. So when you guys take the final, all right, I have chunked it down to Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3. Okay, studies say that it might be a little bit more manageable, okay, if you're studying or if you're taking a final, in terms of understanding the material if you chunk it together. Okay, often it'll occur automatically, all right, What are some other examples of chunking when you chunk information? Like I said, chapters of a textbook is a good one. Okay, they chunk our days into certain events, morning, noon, night. Okay, phone numbers are another example of things that are chunked. 773-220-5758. Okay. Acronyms are things that you've seen that help us visualize and help us organize stuff in more manageable units. Okay, an abbreviation formed the initial components in a phrase or a word. Okay, these components may be individual letters or parts or words names. Be right back, lots of laughs, talk to you later, JK. These are all acronyms for understanding different materials. All right, and then the last one is hierarchies. There are different ways that or strategies you can use in order to understand stuff. Okay, they can compose a few broad concepts and then they can be broken down. I do this a lot with sorts when you're understanding information. Can you sort the graph or chunk the information together? Okay, so some of the stuff we looked at in this presentation is the difference between effortful and automatic processing. Okay, you should understand the difference in terms of how we encode using the spacing effect and serial positioning effect. Stuff at the beginning, primacy, and stuff at the end, okay, recency. You should know the different levels of processing. We do things visually, acoustically, and semantically, understanding meaning. And then different strategies for encoding.